Lookout was a scenario where, like I said earlier, with us and American Steel, where we were kind of pegged as like the new era of Lookout. And I think that new era came maybe a little too late. Like I think that's when the label started to have its own challenges financially and whatnot.
Welcome, everyone, to This Was The Scene, the podcast that takes a look back at the late 90s, early 2000 punk scene. I am your host, Mike Doyle. Before we start, go check out the Stereo's new podcast, Kings of No Hope, the story of the Stereo. It's a deep dive into their band with plenty of fun and drama throughout the series to reward listening with no prior knowledge of the band, their music, or their history. This is leading up to the release of their latest album, 13, so you can go check it out. And you can also check out the episode where I interviewed Rory and Jamie, which is episode 99. And you can do all of that after you listen to this. Ann Beretta is a punk rock band from Richmond, Virginia. Formed in 1996, the band plays straightforward punk with small doses of rockabilly and country mixed into their sound. They spent several years on tour playing with bands including Hot Water Music, All, The Bouncing Souls, Less Than Jake, and City Mates Avail. They were on Fueled by Ramen and Lookout Records in the fall of 2004, and Beretta disbanded until 2012 when they toured Europe and the UK in support of Wild, Young, and Free, an LP released exclusively in Europe by Gunnar Records and made up of demos and outtakes. I reached out to the Instagram account and got Mr. Rob Huddleston to reply and see if he'd like to chat. He said yes, and this is what we talk about. The start of acoustic punk records, the origins of Rumble Seat, how that rougher vocal sound came about, what inspired Forever Family, how they first met Hot Water Music, American Steel, playing the first fest, sending letters to people to book tour shows, Fueled by Ramen, the upcoming Avail shows, and a ton more. Check out their latest album, Rise. It's the first record of new material since 2003's Three Chord Revolution and following 2018's Old Scars, New Blood, a collection of re-recorded songs from the band's catalog, available now on all streaming services. Lastly, Rob tells a story at the very end of the episode about an all cover that he did with the help of Bill Stevenson teaching him how to play it. The link is in the show notes. You just click on that and it'll take you to the Bandcamp page and you can listen to it there. And if you want to support the podcast, just go to patreon.com/thiswasthescene and you can sign up for $1 a month and I'll love you. That's all I got to say, so feel free to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with anyone who would love some punk rock nostalgia. With that said, let's get started. What was the latest record you guys put out? Was that 2018?
We did a record in 2018 called Old Scars, New Blood. And that was, we don't refer to it as a greatest hits or a best of, but it's re-recording of older songs spanning across all of our records and EPs that we had released previously. And the idea there was because we had been kind of out of the loop for a handful of years, we wanted to put something out while we were working on a new record. Now, the time between putting that out in 2018 and releasing a record now is a lot longer than we were expecting. But yeah, so that was the last record we released, 2018. And then prior to that, in 2012, we did a European release that's all just demos and kind of album outtakes. And the last record of new material that we released was 2003. It was the Three Chord Revolution record.
Oh my God. It sounds very Taylor Swift of you to do the re-recording.
To re-record our old songs, yeah. We did it first. We did it before Taylor.
Yeah, you guys are the pioneers. You were the map that she followed to do this.
We'll go with that.
Yeah. I was listening to it. It's really good. I mean, I get like I hate doing this, but just for people who, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this episode are definitely going to be fans of you guys, but I got like a loved ones kind of vibe to it, Gaslight. But you guys were first, so it's almost like I feel like if they were they a band, like was Loved Ones? Is that a band that you ever connected with? I know I'm going to jump Joel over, but did you ever connect with them like when they came out?
Yeah, not really. we knew. We had played, I think, one show with them, and that was sometime in the early 2000s or like mid, I don't remember the year. We played a show in Philly with them and Hot Water Music. I had known a couple of guys from being in the Explosion and had played many shows with them. But yeah, the Loved Ones were a band that I knew of, but not a band that we really like closely connected with until probably years later. I mean, Dave, when he started releasing or even started talking about releasing solo records, I had reached out to him. I don't know if it was like his first solo show, but it was one of his early solo shows. He came to Richmond and played a show with us. That was probably 2008, maybe. So it was a while ago, and he and I have stayed in touch periodically. And same thing with Brian and the Gaslight Anthem. We were not really an active band when Gaslight Anthem took off, but got to know some of those guys pretty well, and stayed in touch with them a little bit. We were not incredibly close, but definitely appreciate the compliment there. Those are both really great bands, and bands that I'm a fan of. Whether or not we influence them in some capacity or not, you'd have to ask those guys. But I think a lot of our inspirations are probably, and references come from a lot of the same places, whether it's Springsteen or Flash, or anywhere in between. So I think we were all drawing from very similar influences.
So today I was listening to, I talk about it all the time. It's Brendan Kelly's podcast, Road to the Skeleton Coast. Have you ever heard of it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Brendan's awesome. I haven't talked to him in many years, but yeah, he's awesome. We definitely had played a bunch of shows together when we were more active touring. And I think every incarnation of every band that he's been a part of, we had played shows with at the time.
So what he does is he goes down and he breaks down every album he's ever been a part of, like from Slapstick to Broadway's to Lawrence Arms and everything. And he's talking about Oh Calcutta, and that comes out like 2006, and it's like right around the time, and that's the thing that like blew them up. But I feel like that was the era where that style, which I lump you guys into, kind of that like folk punk rock, like I would say like it's like the beer punk kind of crowd.
Oh, sure. That's a good way to frame it.
And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about that time is where it kind of shed the light on that genre, which like I said, I lump you guys in. And I want to talk about that because I feel like that probably worked in your favor around that time when like Against Me is coming out and that album blows up. And then, I mean, Hot Water been around forever, but I feel like there was more of people gravitating and encompassing it in that time period. So that's a theory I have that you guys fell into that.
Yeah, I think in some part, not to pat ourselves or on my back or whatever, but yeah, in some part, I mean, we were pretty early into that whole scene too. Like, so if you think about, how many bands and songwriters from punk bands started putting out solo records or acoustic records, we come from like I think a pretty interesting background where we all like different types of music. We all overlap with what we like in the band. But very early on, like even I don't know how well known this is, or even if people remember the band Inquisition, but
I was actually going to ask you to start there because that was the first band, and then it led in. Then you did Ann Beretta after.
yeah, yeah, and even going back to that band Inquisition, which was far more political and hardcore, '90s punk than what Ann Beretta has been or ever really wanted to do. But even in that band, I was the one who I think was a big fan of like singer-songwriter artists. I was a huge fan of MTV's Unplugged when it first really started coming out. Bands like The Alarm and, The Clash to some degree, who had like songs that acoustic guitars were very in the front and a big part of what their music was. Billy Bragg is another one. So I think even when we were in Inquisition, like I was pushing the guys on a regular basis, like, let's just play these songs acoustic. We'll just get a little bar show and we'll do something, we'll make it a holiday kind of thing. So Inquisition actually played 2 or 3 acoustic shows. That then kind of evolved into me starting to write songs on my own, play guitar a little more, play in the bars, bring Thomas along to sing some songs with me or whatever. And then when Ann Beretta started, that was an opportunity to let some of those influences shine a little more than what they had the ability to do in Inquisition. So even our first record, Bitter Tongues, like there's plenty of acoustic guitar there. There's, like my focus has always been on, having really strong choruses and catchy hooks and melodies. Immediately after Bitter Tongues came out, we recorded the album The Other Side of the Coin, which was a point where we were starting to write the next record, but I wanted we had been playing some acoustic shows and I really wanted us to push that and actually make a record. So that record was really the first in a long time. Like if you take The Alarm out or Billy Bragg, like of our scene and our peers in the 90s, it was really the first of its kind.
What year was that?
That was 97, no, that was probably 98, because in 99, To All Our Fallen Heroes came out. And then at some point, the idea was that every record we made, we would fast follow that with some sort of acoustic album, and we could record them at the same time. We could have some of the same songs, what have you. And when we were with Fueled by Ramen, I had written that next record, that acoustic record that I thought we would put out as an Ann Beretta record. And they were the ones that really convinced me, like, this is different enough. We think you should put this out under a different name. Foundation was actually supposed to be the title of that record. The idea there being that the foundation of all of the songs we had ever written was really us sitting around in the couches with acoustic guitars or on the front porch, just playing. And that was kind of the birth of every song that we had ever written. Originally, that was the album title, and it was to be an Ann Beretta record. And the guys at Fueled by Ramen, in fact, I think it was primarily Tony Weinbender, who puts on the Fest, was working at the label at the time. And he was like, this really needs to be your record, not the band's record. So we changed things up. And that really was the first at the time of any punk rock singer, songwriter, frontman doing something solo to that degree, and like really pulling all the distortion back and, doing more singer songwriter acoustic driven stuff. And during that time, like Tim Barry from Avail came into the studio with me, and we were just shooting the shit and talking. And he was like, this is great. This is a really cool idea. So I think it kind of informed and influenced him, Chuck also, Reagan from Hot Music, to start putting out acoustic records. And if you think back, even for Chuck and Chris Waller putting together Rumble Seat, that started in my house. Like, there's a whole story there, but like,
yeah, tell it.
This was probably 99, I think. Chris and Chuck came up to Richmond and kind of lived with me for a couple of weeks during New Year's, just hanging out. And this was pretty common. Like, we did this all the time. I would go down there. They would come up here. We would, play or sing on each other's records and stuff. And I had a pretty common back then, just a 4-track cassette recorder, recorded an entire album in my basement worth of songs, just Chuck and Chris on it with acoustic guitars. And that was the birth of Rumble Seat. Which evolved into, those guys starting to play acoustic shows and, in the clubs, and eventually like Chuck really taking that forward and just making a huge career out of it, and, a huge impact. I mean, from that point forward, I think when Chuck and Tim just being in bigger bands and having a little more popularity at the time, they were really able to take that in a whole new direction. And I think that then influenced a long list of punk singers to pick up an acoustic guitar and start putting out a different type of record and writing different types of songs.
So I think it took a while, because I remember, so I got involved in the scene in like 96, 97, and it was in a band in Jersey, and it was more poppy. I was like into more poppier sounding stuff. So when I heard Hot Water for the first time, that was kind of like what opened the door for me to hear other bands like, you guys, and in that whole direction. And later on, like Against Me, and then Lawrence Arms came around, and I was like, this is a lot rougher sound, because I liked the more polished stuff. And then it took a while, and then when it finally came in, I mean, it's still around. I mean, you even said Fest. Like, Fest literally is it is a place where that style is huge. And that sound, initially when I first heard it around that time, it was like, what the fuck is this? It was hard to digest for me. I felt like that came out of like Richmond specifically, and in Florida. Where do you think that resonated from, or like originated from?
Oh, what a good question. I think for many years, like the late 90s, there was a huge connection between Richmond and Gainesville specifically. We toured with Hot Water Music nonstop for maybe the first 2 years of the band. It was either Hot Water Music, and with bands like Hank Shaw, bands like Discount, who are both from Florida, also being part of that tour. And that was legitimately like an 18-month, maybe almost 2 years tour cycle. If we weren't touring with Hot Water Music, we were touring with Hank Shaw and Discount, or we were touring once Bitter Tongues came out with Less Than Jake. And again, that was like an entire year and a half worth of touring with Less Than Jake, and a huge like learning opportunity for us. But I think getting back to the question, like, there was a lot of common elements beyond music with, I think, Gainesville and Richmond being college towns, being art towns, having each their own music scene and kind of unique sound. that started to influence and blend a little bit, which I think is where your question's coming from. Like, I think brotherhood, sisterhood of bands was just, I mean, I don't even know that I have words to describe it. Like that's where songs of ours like Forever Family came from. That song specifically was kind of a diary of what that Hot Water Music Discount tour was like. And then, the chorus specifically, I remember, here's another story for you. I remember being in Arizona, touring with Hot Water Music and Discount, being in the parking lot of the Jimmy Eat World practice space because they they put on shows in their practice space, and we were playing there that night, and just having a conversation with Chuck of like, to tell him like, hey, I've got this idea for a chorus of a song. It's about you guys, and I want to call it Forever Family. And it then kind of evolved into, and as soon as I get home, I want to get your flame logo tattooed, but I want the words Forever Family around it on my ribs. And just that then became like this whole thing where, of course, the conversation was awesome. I think we both were like hugging and crying in the parking lot. It evolved into the song. The song became, I think, something big for us. It was a very personal song, but it resonated with a lot of people. It then became this thing where, like, I think bands are really lucky when something hits in a way that people want to remember it forever. So, it was one thing for us. I think every member of our band got a Forever Family tattoo in that era. Every member of Hot Water Music got a Forever Family tattoo. And then we started showing up to shows and people were showing us like, look at my Forever Family tattoo. So those kind of moments, like, thinking back to them, I haven't thought about that in a long time, but those are pretty amazing moments to realize you've got that sort of impact on anyone, but many people who are willing to put your words on their body. And I've seen many Avail Dixie tattoos, and Bouncing Souls have a huge like tattoo following, so there's many bands get their lyrics or some reference tattooed on their fans' body, but I don't know that I ever thought that would happen for us, or that people would care enough to do something that permanent.
So, but when you got that, you had the idea of it about a song you had just wrote. So the song wasn't even out yet, and you're like, when this does come out, I want to do this tattoo idea.
Yeah, basically. I mean,
That's
and it was
crazy.
kind of asking, at the time the song wasn't even written. I had a chorus in mind, and the chorus references, the water's edge, which is a reference back to Hot Water Music. And so just asking permission, like out of respect, like, hey, I've got this idea. I want to reference some of what we're experiencing in a song, and like this brotherhood and this thing that we're creating together. Like there was no question, or no, like, there was really no response other than a big smile and a hug. And then that just kind of became something all of its own. And I don't know if I actually answered your question, but it
It's not,
so we can get back to that too if you want.
I think you did. I mean, I think it's kind of opening up, right? So this kind of like this next part. I usually go back to like how you started the band and everything, but I like where this is at now, and we can kind of like maybe dip into that. So at this point, you guys are already touring, so it's your way into it, and I can jump back. But for the fact that like, how did you guys? Is it like two parts, and then I'm gonna ask the second part in a minute. But how did you first connect with Hot Water? Was it based on your guys having similar sound and someone booked you, or you just happen to bump into each other when one of you was on the road?
Yeah, good question. There's a bunch there. So, and I think it'll also answer that how did we get started question. So, Inquisition was touring. We toured like crazy, and we got in the habit and this was something I think we picked up from our friends in Avail. We started doing these, like, when the winter hit, we wanted to go somewhere warm. So we would do this like Florida vacation tour. I think the guys in Avail gave it that name, and we kind of co-opted it. But the idea was, it's December, it's the time between Christmas and New Year's. Let's go down to Florida and play some shows and hang out with, our friends. We first met Hot Water Music playing a show with them. I think it was at the Common Grounds, or it could have been, there was a small book club. The name is escaping me. There was a small like bookstore in Gainesville that would do shows. So Inquisition played with Hot Water Music. Oh, actually, I'm totally wrong. That's later. Our first meeting of Hot Water Music was at a place in Biloxi, Mississippi called the Little House. It was a little trailer. on a piece of property. It was like a really amazing family and bunch of kids who put on shows in Biloxi. So we played with them, and so it was Inquisition, Hot Water Music, and I think Ass Suck, or it could have been, if you remember, a band called Judd from Gainesville. They were awesome. They just, it was I don't even know how to explain them. They didn't play instruments. They just vocalized guitar and drums, so it was
Really?
awesome.
That's amazing.
So that's the name Judd, because they would just like Judd, and like
Okay.
vocalize musical instruments. But they were awesome. But that was our first meeting with them. A little while later, so Ann Beretta started. Inquisition broke up in September of '96, like months before our Revolution record came out. In typical form for me, at least, this idea of not being on tour in December really just drove me nuts, because I had done that for the last like 4 years or something. Russ and I started Ann Beretta. We started writing songs, and I kid you not, like within a couple months, we were on tour. We basically just used the momentum that we had from Inquisition touring, all the contacts we had, and we just started booking tours. We knew there was something in us that we had to be on tour in December. Otherwise, things were just going to be wrong.
That's when like bands like typically want to not tour because it's so freaking cold and it's scary. 'Cause
Right.
it's
But
icy.
that's exactly what we wanted to do, was go somewhere warm. Right. So we had to be in
Oh,
Florida. We had to be in Florida for the Florida Vacation Tour '96,
I gotcha.
but
Okay.
we didn't have a band. So how are we going to do that? And Russ and I had been writing some songs together. We had a band that, it was kind of my first attempt at singing, at writing songs like from start to finish, and fronting a band. Terrifying. But we played like 2 or 3 house shows, basement shows. I think we did one club show in Richmond, and then that band became Ann Beretta. So we had a couple songs to pull from already, but the group of us, we wrote about 10 songs in 2.5 months and went on tour. And so at that point, again, we just started calling our friends, people who had put on shows before, other bands, and Hot Water Music was one of the first bands we reached out to for that tour. I don't think we played with them, but they all came to the show when we were in Gainesville. That then just started to spark conversation of, neither of our bands, obviously we were very new, but Hot Water Music had not yet toured across the country. They had not been to the West Coast. So Jason Black and I start talking about like, hey, why not? Let's go tour together. You'll book half of it. I'll book half of it. We both have contacts, and we'll just let's go do it. And so that was really the start of that, like really deep kind of connection with that band. And like I said, we spent easily 18 months, if not 2 years, just back to back touring with Hot Water Music.
So the second part, this is a perfect lead in what you just talked about. Do you think like having a similar sound to them, because you guys were so tight, and do you think having a similar sound added more to like the glue of you guys being so tight and touring so much together?
Yeah, I think so, but I think I don't know how really tight or connected our sounds
Or
were at the time.
yeah, like a rougher kind of sound.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of that though is, I think both of our bands were playing like fast, energetic music. And I'm only saying this about myself. I was not, and still don't claim to be, like a great singer by any stretch. My voice was really, I didn't know how to use my voice or how to sing properly. And because of that, there was a bit of growl and gravel to it, which just kind of became my thing, for a while. That's just how I sang. Chuck and Chris both have very deep, robust, gravelly voices. And I think there's some element there that kind of connected us, or made us work really well together. I think stylistically we looked different. We played different styles of punk or hardcore, but we worked really well together. And I think because of that, we also influenced one another in really interesting ways. Like, again, just another random story. Like, I remember part of that tour being Chuck and Chris had big beards and long hair. And by the end of that tour, they were clean shaven and short hair, and it was just really random things like that we would influence. And then we were picking up equally random and odd things from them. So it was a really interesting time, and I think we might have even on one tour started growing beards just because we had never done that, so like, again, the most random things, but I think that's where some of the fun and the brotherhood kind of came from, and influencing one another. I think we complemented each other in ways that maybe other bands didn't at the time. And I think a lot of people remember that time in a very positive light. Listening back to some of our records and, talking about Hot Water, like some of their early records, like the production quality, the budgets weren't what they were later on. The sound quality may not have been what they were. So I know listening back to our catalog, like I cringe a little bit when I hear Bitter Tongues or some of the stuff we did before that. But when I think about the live setting, the clubs, the shows, the bands we toured with, the experience of being in that small, sweaty room with whether it was 50 people or 500 people, just having that moment, I think that trumps any of the inconsistencies or not being able to sing that great, or the production value of a record. Like I think it was those moments that people remember, and I think people really gravitated to, like, if you saw both of our bands coming to town together, that was a show to go see. Like people just knew, okay, that's going to be a really solid show. There's going to be a lot of energy, a lot of action, and that's something we want to be a part of.
Yeah, I remembered the two of you guys, your name. I remember both your names like as a touring package. I think I remember that. It was almost like I talked to the guys from My Pal Trigger. We were talking
Oh yeah,
about,
yeah,
yeah, we were talking like how them and Discount were like buds, and there's like
yep,
certain bands that would have it, like Weston and Lifetime were like buds. There was, I mean, they were wildly different in sound, but there was, I always loved that when I saw like the two bands that you could tell they were like biffles. They would just like always in the
yeah.
room.
And I think just kind of reflecting back to some of the years, like Hot Water Music had a really interesting, like, we spent a couple of years touring with them. They spent a couple of years touring with Avail. Leatherface came over and, did tours with Hot Water Music. So I guess going back to where we started the conversation, like those are examples of Richmond, Gainesville connection between two bands, whether, in the case of like Leatherface, huge influence and inspiration for Hot Water Music. And again, if you think about Frankie's voice, very much similar to Chuck and Chris, very much similar to at the time mine. So it all made sense the way it kind of unfolded and happened. It was very natural, very organic. There was nothing forced about it, which I think just made it that much better and more enjoyable and powerful for the audiences. Like there was nothing forced in any of those relationships or any of those tours.
Actually, when you said Leatherface, I was like think about it, and it made me think of American Steel.
Yep.
Was that another band that you said you guys you'd play shows with back then or tour with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was another one kind of later on. Once we were on Lookout, at the time we signed with Lookout and put out our record with them. American Steel was also right there at the same time. So I think our records came out just months apart. We were both kind of positioned as like the new face, the new era of Lookout Records for a little while. So we also likewise became really good friends. We spent maybe not a full year, but pretty close to it. Like we definitely toured around the country and Canada together, and then picked up shows here and there with each other wherever it made sense to. So that was another example of like a band very similar in style and sound and influence from the West Coast that we became really great friends with. And I loved touring with those guys. And I think we haven't seen them or played a show together. I think there was a festival in it actually might have been Raleigh or Durham that Scotty Sandwich puts on. What was that? Death to False Hope. Is that what it was? I
No
forget. I
idea.
think that's festival. And that was maybe, I don't know, 2008 or nine, I think, when they started playing some shows again. That was the last time we saw them, but, still reach out to them occasionally. And, I think that's the great thing about kind of experiencing being in a band and touring. Even if you don't see these people for months or years, that connection is always there. And it's really easy nowadays to just pick up a phone and shoot someone a text or through social media or what have you, and just stay connected. So all of those people that we're talking about right now are some of the best friends I've had in all of my life and continue to have today. And I wouldn't be able to say that without, having been in a band and having played music and toured.
So it's funny when you said that because I was thinking about when I would see your guy, like hear of you guys touring, like your that crew that we just talked about, like when whatever it was together or separate. And I always felt that the crowds that would go to those shows, if you guys were like, I don't know if it's together or separate, but I always saw it as if your fans showing up to those shows were like super fucking solid and like into like really into that music, where I felt in other scenes it was a bit more. I mean, it's kind of a it's a strong statement to say like they weren't as into the band, because I mean that could be very false, but I felt like there was longevity, I guess, and I think it's been proven to this day that I'm kind of right. But when I would hear of these shows, I was like, man, like that crowd there, like I wish we had a crowd like that coming to our like all of our shows across like the country. It just felt like they just showed up there like, oh, we're fucking here for this, instead of being like, yeah, we're just coming to a show.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the case, at least for us, until a time came where it wasn't. But yeah, I think the interesting thing there is, and the thing that I kind of reflect back on is, you're also talking about a time before smartphones and social media, and there was an urgency to be to go to shows, to experience new bands, new music, to be in that moment with hundreds of other people. And you just the it wasn't as readily available as it is. You couldn't go to social media or go to YouTube and find your next favorite band. It was a very different time than what we see now. Like, I think for me, when I started to recognize like kind of social media taking off, back then it was like MySpace and stuff, but you started to see, and this truly for me is when I started to get a little maybe disillusioned or maybe a little unhappy with just music as a potential living or as an industry. Like, you started to see a lot of bands getting signed based on how many followers they had on MySpace. Bands are getting signed today just based on Facebook or Instagram presence and streaming and things. But you started to see bands, and I'm not going to name any, but you started to see bands who had never played a show outside of their hometown, who suddenly were in a bus on the Warped Tour as their first tour, and that really started to. I think that was a moment where things really started to change for a lot of bands, us included. I think one mistake that we made as a band is we may have toured too much. We stayed on tour 10 months out of the year for almost a decade.
Jesus Christ.
And part of what ended up happening around that same time, early 2000s, I think we were kind of considered every city's local band because we were just there so often. Every 3 months you could see us play no matter where you were. And so at that point, you start to things like Napster, and music starts to become free. People know that, well, if I miss the band tonight, I'm going to see it on YouTube in a couple weeks. Or in our case, if I miss the band tonight, I'm going to see them in 2 or 3 months because they'll be back. That really started to hurt us. Like, all of those things kind of combined at the same time really started to hurt us and our turnouts. We went our biggest tour, our biggest headlining show was actually a show we played in Louisville, Kentucky, where we had like 1,600 people show up. And maybe second to that, it was 600 or 800 people on a regular basis showing up. A year later, it was 200. A year after that, it was 80, depending on where we were. So
What
we
years? What years was this around?
this was early 2000s. And this ultimately, like, for us, we made some, and I'll take the blame because I did it, but I made some poor decisions, I think, with some of the people or labels that we were partnering with. We got to a point where we wanted to have a manager, thinking that would take us to a new level or the next level. It didn't work out. A different booking agent, a different label. So I think I may have made some poor choices at that time that kind of backfired on us. But ultimately, we went from having really successful tours, big crowds, to suddenly, 2 years later, coming home from a tour where every show, like many shows, were starting to get canceled while we were on the road. When the shows were happening, they weren't being promoted, or people weren't showing up for whatever the reason might have been. Not to blame anything, but we really came home from that tour. It was early 2004, I think. It was like the end of 2003, where we were just so exhausted from 8 years or whatever it was of touring that hard and heavy, to then suddenly realize like the people aren't showing up, we're not doing something right. And I think we were just burnt out and exhausted. So we came home from that not really talking about taking a break or breaking up or whatever it might have been, but we all kind of just knew that we needed to stop, we needed to pause. And we did for 5 years. We didn't practice. We didn't play. I think I put out a couple more foundation records, but even that, I don't think I played or picked up a guitar for almost a year because giving up or making that decision to stop was such a huge deal to the degree where I just didn't even know who I was anymore. My persona, or what people know me for, is being the frontman in this band that is moderately popular. Now that I don't have that, who am I? And I went through like like a year of depression and like not knowing what I wanted to do. I was going to go back to school and get a corporate job or whatever, and being really unhappy about that, the thought of doing that. And it took quite a while to want to play music again or to come back to it. And in truth, even when by the time I decided, okay, this is who I am, I need to be making music, even if people don't hear it, and started really planning like my next solo record, foundation record, I I reached out to the band I knew, the friends I had, the people that had been with me for the last, 10 years or more. The band that played on the foundation record that I released in 2009, the Chimborazo record, that was Ann Beretta. Like that was all of us making a record together under a different name. I'd written all the songs and kind of brought them to the guys and got them to we started playing live as that band. So, again, same people, same players, different music, different style, but we didn't walk away from each other. We just kind of, had to take that moment and pause and kind of reassess what we wanted to do. And it took years to come back to that. And then after doing that for a year and a half or so, we all just really kind of at the same time looked at each other saying like, hey, I really miss playing punk music. I really miss playing fast, energetic music. I want a crowd that's going to get as excited about the music we're playing and dance and slam dance and whatever. And that's when we were like, well, we never really quit Ann Beretta. Let's book a show. And so it all just kind of very organically, naturally started to happen again. Now, we didn't go tour. We didn't go overboard and do a ton. We did tour Europe for, I think, 3 weeks in 2012. And we were playing, maybe half a dozen shows a year and really focusing on festivals. We would go play Pooza Fest and the Fest in Gainesville and, anything else that we could find. But it became more about, let's keep this fun. It's not a job. Where can we play and what can we play where we selfishly don't have to worry about drawing a crowd on our own? That's why festivals became.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that. Like, why was that your focus for festivals? But that
And
makes
then
sense.
and then we also just decided like we don't need to write new songs. Like let's just, again, we want to have fun. Like let's get back to why we started this thing in the first place. And if it starts to feel like work, we don't want to do it. That's also in part why it took us so long to make this new record, because we would try to write songs and we were maybe out of practice. It was harder. I think we also were more critical about what we were doing. So even if something was good and we played it live 3 or 4 times, we would come back to it and just be like, oh, that sucks. Let's not do that anymore. So the whole process of like becoming comfortable again to put ourselves out there with new material, new songs, it took a long time to get there. And I don't know that, thinking about the record we just made, I don't know that I would have wanted it any other way. Like I think the record we just made is pretty amazing. I'm excited for people to hear it. I think the inspiration behind it would not have been there 5 years ago. So I think everything happens when it's supposed to, and the time is what it is. I think, if you'd asked me in my 40s if I thought I would be writing the best music of my life, I would have probably laughed at it 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but I certainly think that's true.
So we covered a lot of ground, so I'm gonna go back a lot with certain things. But in one part, and this kind of leads back to what I was saying before, is when you guys broke up. What year was that? Well, when you stopped for for
Yeah,
five
yeah.
years.
So that was coming home from kind of a winter tour at the end of 2003, maybe early like January, February 2004. We so it was early 2004. The last show we played kind of in that time frame was a show in Richmond. We played like, the big rock radio stations put on festivals every year, and we had already booked that, 6 months in advance. So we played that, and that was kind of our unannounced, last show, at least for that time. Like I said, we just we just realized we needed a break, so we took it.
When did you guys play Fest?
We actually have played many times. We played the first fest.
Oh, wow.
I was actually just talking with Tony the other day, and I didn't realize it had been 20 years.
Yeah, the 20 years was supposed to be this year, but they got paused. It's next year. Well, it's this
It's
year we're in.
yeah, it's this year.
Yeah.
So this is Fest 20. So I guess technically, yeah, you're right. With the pandemic, it's been 21 years. But we actually we played the first fest. Tony, I don't know how well known this is, but Tony's from Virginia. He played in bands in Virginia that, even going back to Inquisition, that we played with on a regular basis, a band called Swank. And so we knew each other for many years. While in college, Tony started putting on a festival at his college, and that ran, for several years, even after he graduated and left. So the college still continued to put that festival on. That was the predecessor to the fest that we know today. So we were, just because, again, we had worked with him in the past, we knew him, we were friends. I think him being in a band previously, he knew a lot of people. So that first year was a really awesome fest. It was much smaller and very different than what we've all come to know more recently. But even then, that was a time where, Ann Beretta played on Saturday, and on Sunday I was playing an acoustic show at the fest. And I think every time we've played it, it's been that format where the full band would play on one day and then I'll play somewhere else the next day.
So actually, kind of to take from that, that's still a thing. Like I just went to Fest, this past Fest. This is the only time I've ever been to it, and they would do that. Like the guy from Spanish Love Songs, they played a full set, and then so were you like the first one that started that, like kind of not like just randomly, or did they do that with other bands too, where he's like, hey, I have this idea that I want you and you to do an acoustic set the next day?
I think we were probably the first. Again, it was the first fest. I think.
Was it your idea or his idea?
Well, I think it was possibly a combination. I don't know. I'll give the credit to Tony. But because he was at the time, I think when it started, I don't remember if he was working at Fueled by Ramen or if he had moved over to No Idea. But it was at the time when that first foundation, that first like solo record had just come out. So we were treated like two different bands. You guys can come play a full Ann Beretta punk show in the club. And then a lot of the shows that first year were not even in the clubs. They were in people's backyards or on the front porch. I'm going to say he asked if I wanted to do that because I'm sure that's how it happened. It was, my response was, well, I don't know if I want to play by myself. To which his response was, okay, cool. There's plenty of people here. Let's put a band together, come down a couple days early and just practice a few songs. And so that first fest, we did an Ann Beretta show at like a sports bar. It was a really random place. I forget what it's called. Might have been called like Gators or something, But then the next day, like we played on the front porch at someone's house. I played with Donovan, who's the bass player in Ann Beretta, Chad, he was in the band Swank with Tony. He also, I forget some of the other bands he was in, but he was living in Gainesville. He played like banjo really well. So I was like, dude, come play on these songs. John Gaunt, who I think everybody probably knows most from playing with Chuck Reagan, he jumped in and joined on a couple songs, So it was a really cool, just like, again, really organic, really cool atmosphere. We all knew each other. We'd all been hanging out in Gainesville for years, or Richmond. So it was just, again, this like really natural thing of like, hey, who's going to be around and can pick up an instrument and, learn 3 chords really quickly. And we practiced like once together, or we probably sat around a couch in someone's house and drank some beer and played into the night, whatever. But the next day we played that show in that front porch, and that just became a thing. Like, and again, I don't know what the evolution of that was, but for us specifically, anytime we would go play fest, and I think it's probably been 5 or 6 times in the 20 years, that was just always the conversation starter. Hey, Tony, we'd like to come down and play. And if it's easier for you or it makes more sense, go ahead and book me a solo show too. Like we'll do both sets. And so just over time, that's just become the natural way that we go play fest.
So Fest is like its own little world.
Yeah.
Like it literally it brings the same. I mean, I went to number 19 and it looked like that would be the same exact style of crowd that would have been there like fucking 20 years ago. And so did you kind of find that
The
when
fest crowd is always awesome.
yeah, and it's like super chill. You never feel any any shitty people or anything like that. I guess the question is when you're doing this, you're seeing the scene around you start to evolve and become this new alternative press teen beat kind of shit that's going on, which I talk about all the time, and it's like early 2000s and it starts getting a little fucking weird and some really good bands come from that era and some like just shit starts to happen and you guys are in the middle of this carrying a sound over from the mid 90s into this whole scene trying to be like okay, are we still relevant as sound? Like, how do we are we fitting? Are we not fitting? But then when you go to Fest, I feel like that would have been a space where it was consistent, but when you left that, it was a whole different world.
Yeah, maybe so. I think the cool one of the cool things about Fest is that yes, very much like that is the crowd, that is the atmosphere. But I think Fest is one of those events where, and maybe Punk Rock Bowling is very similar, where it's one of those few events where I think bands come out of the woodwork wanting to be part of that. There's no shortage of bands hitting up Tony and the staff to come play, but it's also a place where bands, like us who maybe haven't been active in a few years, will also reach out and come play. So, the fact that he over the last several years specifically have just gotten some of the biggest, best like reunion events or, bands who, like I said, haven't been playing regularly will come to those events. And it makes it that much bigger and better. Now, to your point about the timing and kind of the early 2000s and, the change kind of worldwide in the scene, like I hadn't really considered that, but I think you really hit on something of like that we were absolutely dealing with and thinking, are we still relevant? Is what we were doing 5 years ago still something that people want to pay attention to? And maybe that was also maybe a big reason why people stopped paying attention. And some of those bands that you're referencing are also some that I was referring to earlier, where they became super popular real quickly. And like I said earlier, like first tour might have been on a bus at the Warped Tour versus really really. I think the cool thing, and I think maybe, and this is going to sound really jaded and like old of me, but I think the big thing that I recognized was what it meant to pay your dues was very different come early 2000. And again, this is going to be one of those like your granddad saying he walked uphill in the snow barefoot to get every day. But like if I think back to like us when we were cutting our teeth and kind of getting out there for the first time, it was an era in the mid 90s, like 93, 94, 95 when Inquisition was touring. We were, you didn't have smartphones. We didn't even have cell phones back then. It was, we were on tour, and this was Thomas and myself. Thomas, I'm sure everyone knows who I'm talking about, is in Strike Anywhere. But he and we were using, there was these phone dialers that you used to be able to go to Radio Shack, which I think doesn't exist anymore either. And there were kits, and it would basically mimic the sound the tone that quarters made into a payphone. So we would carry one of those with us, and we would go when we would stop for gas or we would stop for food. We would spend most of that time sitting in the parking lot at the payphone booking our next tour. And that was what like paying your dues kind of meant to us at the time. It was eating shit. It was $5 a day per diem if you even had that. It was getting paid, $40 or $50 a show. It was playing in anywhere and everywhere, big town, small town, VFW halls, garages, basements, backyards, whatever it was, maybe to 3 people, maybe to 300 people. You never knew what you were going to get, but that was all part of the experience. Like I wouldn't trade that for anything because it made us, I think, a little more resilient, a little tougher. It made us appreciate what we did get when we got something. So I wouldn't change that. I wouldn't change that at all. And like, going back to what I was saying earlier, like when I think about the bands who got record deals because they had 100,000 followers on MySpace or something like that, those bands didn't last, but for one or two records or a handful of years, like I think there was a big like missed opportunity for a lot of those bands to even experience what that was like to work really hard for something and to earn it. Not that they don't deserve it or earn it in different ways. Again, being the old guy in the room, it's just not the way we did it. And so, and I think there was a time where what audiences expected, what people in bands expected, how they were able to gain a following was just very different, than what we were doing at the time and what we kind of continued to do throughout our career, which was grassroots. It was build it two, three, four people at a time, knowing that the next time you come to this town, we hope there's going to be five extra people there, and we'll do it again and again and again, and suddenly there'll be 100 or 200 or 500 people there.
I think one thing that you said before really kind of it encapsulates what you're saying now is that you guys took a break for 5 years, got back together. You're like, man, I really want to play again. You start playing because you loved it. The band gets back together. You start playing whenever you want to, and sure, you do it in a more comfortable way where you're like, I definitely want to pay some bills and make sure that this is going to be fun and we're going to have like people there. So it's different. But and then like you guys are putting on a record now. You got to think about maybe some of those bands, and I don't know exactly who you're referencing, but there's the bands that kind of popped up at that time because they saw opportunity and they wrote it and they elevated fast, but then they burned out, and it's like they're not potentially maybe writing records today. So it's what brought you in for the long run, and it's still in you. And then there's those things that popped up where they're like, we never played a show, but we're on a tour bus now, and you're like, what the fuck? And then they're probably like, yeah, we don't even do that. Like I do this job in tech now, and I don't even care to write
Yeah,
music
yeah.
anymore. And
And I think, it's like every generation or every decade, like there's going to be some big shift or change that happens. I think for the 90s, it was very DIY. It was very working class to be in a band. It was, you were doing things on your own. You were putting out your own records. You were promoting your band. I mean, I kid you not, we were mailing cassette tapes or CDs 6 months in advance of wanting to play a show to promoters or clubs just to see if they would call us back. We were writing paper letters. We were writing letters and mailing them to people, asking if we could come play. Prior to like the dialers and such. But it's just a very different time. So I think it was more difficult to gain an audience to do anything, but because of that, it was more rewarding. We were also being in Richmond, like we took a lot of influence from DC and bands like Fugazi and the whole Discord thing. So like we won't play shows for more than $5. The minute we won't play anything but all ages shows. And we did get to a point where that was no longer sustainable, which became a big conversation. It was something that every band was dealing with, but every band also caught a lot of shit for. Was the first time you charged $7 for your show, people complained about it. The first time you played a 21 and up show or an 18 and up show, there was, even if there was no one wanting to come to your show that was under that age, people would still make a point to complain about it. Versus where we are today or where we were 10 years ago, access to music, to an audience, being able to send an email instead of putting a stamp on an envelope, sending an MP3 instead of mailing a cassette tape or a CD. Like, it's just a very different way of doing it. It doesn't mean it's better or worse or wrong or right. It's just different. And I think that's been something that I know I've been experiencing and kind of thinking, putting this record out. Again, we went to a very DIY approach. That's what we knew. That's how we were raised and grew up as a band. So we made the record ourselves. We paid for the record ourselves. We're now promoting the record ourselves, putting it out, releasing it ourselves. And I'm starting to like get a really insane education on how different things are today than they were in 1999, And so it's kind of fun. It's a little scary.
well, what are you noticing? Like what's yeah, so frustrating, scary. Like what are you noticing as a big like well, I see A, B, and C as being way different.
Yeah. Well, I think so. As an example, typically, like, there's, well, booking shows, booking tours, getting your music to people is way easier now than it was in the 90s or early 2000s, right? Just like what I was saying, like sending an MP3 or a WAV file instead of mailing something and then not knowing if it was ever received, or having to wait for someone to then mail you back to let you know, like, hey, I mean, imagine booking a tour through mail just for a second. Like anyone listening, like imagine that mailing a letter to Gilman Street to say, hey, we'd like to, and it's February, and saying, hey, we'd love to come play in October, and them writing something back, or maybe you were lucky enough that they would give you a phone call, but that's very different than everyone's contact information is publicly known. You can go to any club website and there's a call to book, email to book, link. And so that piece is it's just way easier, which is awesome. There's streaming services and digital distribution. Like this is something we recently, I think when Lookout ended, all of our Lookout Records catalog, we fully own that. Have been working on, getting ownership of our full catalog and putting that out on streaming services. I was surprised at how easy that is today. You get a digital distribution, you set up your profile, you pay, 50, $60 for a year or 2 years, and you've just got immediate access to put any WAV file or MP3 up, and it will automatically distribute to every streaming service. That is vastly different than, and this still goes on today, of course, but that is vastly different than calling record stores to see if they will carry your record that you just put out yourself and you're a band from Virginia that no one's ever heard of. That's insanely different. And so just having that quick, easy access is, for a band, is amazing. So as an example, we didn't really put much thought into when this new record would come out, like release date wise. I just knew that as I started to learn more about, some of this digital distribution and streaming services and such, we just got the masters back for that record 2 weeks ago, and it will be live on every streaming service in 2 weeks. You know what I'm saying? So the speed at which we could release this record was incredibly different. Now, granted, we don't have a physical release plan yet, so there's no vinyl or CDs or anything, if people even buy CDs anymore. But it's just so easy to get music out. Now, the downside of that is, going back to what we were talking about earlier, there's no real urgency to go see live music. I knew as a 16-year-old, the only way I would be introduced to new bands and new music is to go to the Sunday matinees in my hometown. And that's where I met new friends. That's where I was introduced to new bands. That's when I first saw, whether it was, and we're talking 90s, so whether it was Fugazi or the Descendants or the Smashing Pumpkins, played a free show in our hometown. Like there were those events that you had to go to in order to experience new music, and you felt the need to buy whatever that band had on the table, the 7-inch that they pressed themselves, or the record or the t-shirt or what have you. I don't think that urgency still exists because it's so easy to access millions of songs through these streaming channels or through YouTube. What that also does for bands is you're now in this vast sea of millions of artists, which in some way is really great, right? Like everyone is kind of on an equal playing field, able to get out their music and gain an audience. But the downside of that is you're not putting yourself out there. And again, this is just my opinion, but you wouldn't have that same urgency to even go on tour. Why would I go on tour if I can put up 3 songs on YouTube, get 1 million views, and suddenly YouTube is telling me they're going to pay me for those views? Like, why go play live? I'll just stay in my home and with my laptop and make music and put it out there. So I feel like there's plenty of bands, or artists, musicians, who might not be getting 1 million views or any views at all because there's this abundance of content out there. Then also you've got these bands who never leave their home, never leave their hometown, don't even play live shows. And so there's a big miss there that, again, just kind of reflecting back on it, I'm glad we did the things we did. We were, again, very DIY oriented, and, putting ourselves out there meant a lot of hard work. So the reward was just, like I said earlier, that much greater because of it. So pros and cons to every story, right? Like it's definitely easier, but with that ease today comes a lot of downside, I think, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I'm very involved in the whole digital space just from I do a bunch of shit, and like I have like a company that I have, and I do like a comic, and I do this, and so I see where you can actually play around with it. If I was a fucking band nowadays, I mean, you're right, you can put I think a lot of bands they struggle to make money, and I think one way is if you have a good fan base, it's almost like there's a theory. I don't know if you like know who Tim Ferriss is. You're the 4 Hour Work Week, and he always,
Yeah,
yeah, he's a podcast, and he talks about thousand greatest, thousand greatest fans is all you need as an artist, a band, a creator. And if you kind of create a space around that, you can have a lot of fun with it. Like, this is just me, just kind of just ranting for a second, but if you have an audience, the fun thing is like if you're on Instagram, right? Instagram has so many fun things like stories. Stories, like I use it for the podcast all the time, and I'll say, "Hey, what was your favorite album cover from the late '90s?" And people will write it. So then I take that and I find their answer, and I go on Google, I download it to my phone, and I'll do like 10 people will answer, and then I'll upload it to my stories, and I'll tag and I'll reply to them so they see it. And it's like you're kind of creating this whole thing. I'll do questions about old podcast episodes. It's like a band could say like, "Hey, we're doing a live Q&A for 10 minutes. Ask me about this one song," or here's a breakdown on I'm surprised bands don't even do their own podcasts and say, "Hey, we're gonna break down our old albums and just do 10 episodes and that's it." There's so many cool things you can fucking do, and that's like how to build a bigger audience and actually maybe make money and shit. But you're right. You made me think about what when you see like if someone's just like, "Oh, I don't have to see them because they're on YouTube and I can watch the show." It's so different because if you see something on YouTube, the energy that you feel at a live show just doesn't even
oh, it
exist.
doesn't exist. Yeah.
And it's almost actually it's funny because it's opposite because I was thinking if you see like a football game on Sunday, that's way more exciting on TV than when you go to the stadium and watch it.
And you also have like that's the football game example. Like that's an example where, you know, even watching from home, people invite their friends over. They make a
Right.
party out of it. You've got 10 people in a living room throwing chips and pizza at each other and yelling at the TV. Like there's an energy component there that doesn't exist if you're sitting at your desk or on your couch by yourself watching a YouTube video of a live band.
That's a great that is an excellent way to put that. You're totally right. Yeah, 100%.
And you brought up another really great point. Like, yeah, bands do not make money through streaming. Like years ago, this is like even when actually it's not that long ago, like 10 years ago, I have a 1 cent royalty check that I never cashed. It cost more to send me the check or to print it on a piece of paper than I got paid. And that's from, that was my awakening to the fact that streaming services, you might get paid for every time someone hears your song, 1/100th of a penny. And so, in order to make any of that money, you've got to have millions and millions of streams and people listening to your record. I read an article, part of this recent exercise of learning about digital streaming and such. I read a really cool article, disappointing, but good insight. For every million plays or streams that an artist gets, they're averaging only about $3,000 of revenue. So if you think like in the old days, I mean, if you think old days, man, I can't believe I just said that. Fuck. But if you think about it, like, the whole music industry at large is like greatly changed. Like bands don't like the concept of writing an album has gone. Like it's all about singles, it's all about streams and downloads. And so the idea of like writing an album is kind of a lost art. There are you'd be hard pressed to find. I mean, granted, there is the Taylor Swift or the Coldplays, but you'd be hard pressed to find bands with longevity and popularity, that you would have seen 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Like there's never going to be another Queen or Led Zeppelin or U2 or these bands that, some of them still together, they can of course fill stadiums, but that's the bands that get to that level are few and far between now, where it used to be not commonplace, but it wasn't unheard of. So it's just different times, and I think that's at the core of it. That's the simplest way to frame it. Like that's really all it is. It's just different time.
Well, I think like the thing I liked about back in the day is when I would learn about newer bands. A lot of bands, I remember reading zines that were
Yeah,
in
yeah.
like, I mean, there would be local zines that were really small, and they'd interview bands that were local or maybe a bigger band. But then there was a couple of them that had more multiple issues, but you'd go to your local record store and they'd be there. So it was a little bit bigger. And I'd open it up. I'd be like, "Who's Piebald? And what's this cave-in thing about?" And then the pictures would be blurry, so you didn't really know what the band looked like, and it added this mystery. And so when they came locally, I've talked this before too. And so when they came locally, me personally, I'm like, I have to go. What is this? What do they look like? This is exciting. There was two moments where you guys are on labels that are pretty well known, and then after that, you guys, it seems like the labels you're on seem either they were local, smaller, or like not as big, obviously. So you're on Feel by Ramen and Lookout. Did both of those label? I mean, yeah, did both those labels do what they presented themselves as doing?
Um, yeah, and I mean, in both examples, it was our choice to leave the labels and try to do something different. And again, like I said earlier, like some of the decisions we made and the timing of which we made them may not have been the right ones. Looking back at it, like Fuel by Ramen was an awesome label to be part of, and again, not to bring Tony up again, but that was kind of his doing. Like, had sent him a cassette tape with some early demos, like the first four songs we'd ever written. And he then, I think he was touring and playing with, doing something with Less Than Jake. So he's playing the cassette to some of those guys. Vinny's got a label that he's just started maybe a year or two before that. It's primarily ska, but they've only put out 5 or 6 records. I think we were like the 7th or 8th record they put out. So the label started to evolve a little bit, like maintaining the ska kind of focus, but started to get more like rock oriented or punk bands. The label started to grow, and it was awesome. We left the label because we grew up, on Lookout bands, and there was always this idea of, wouldn't it be great to be part of that record label's story? And so it was a big deal when they reached out to us to see, if they could do a record. We were actually in the studio recording our second record, the To All Our Fallen Heroes record. We were halfway through making that record when I got the call, and we collectively decided, like, okay, we're going to call Fuel by Ramen. We'll let them know that we want to move this record, take this record over to Lookout. Now, if I think about it, the timing of that, like as soon as we left Fuel by Ramen, they started, they signed bands like Yellow Card, and Jimmy Eat World put a record out. I think, later, a couple years later, it was bands like Paramore and Panic at the Disco. Oh, and Fall Out Boy, like huge bands. They were getting, major label distribution and financing, and, the label just took off. It took off in new directions musically and, from a band perspective, but it really just took off. So I've had many people ask, like, how different might your life be if your second record came out with Fuel by Ramen, because that was the time when they really blew the fuck up. I can't answer that question. I could, if I wanted to do so, I could have some huge regrets about the decision to go to Lookout. I don't, but occasionally it's like, I do wonder what might have been different. Lookout was a scenario where, like I said earlier, with us and American Steel, where we were kind of pegged as like the new era of Lookout. And I think that new era came maybe a little too late. Like I think that's when the label started to have its own challenges financially and whatnot. So, and also after by the time we put our second record out on Lookout, I think the label was taking a change in direction musically also. Like they were going a little more garage rock and indie versus like the East Bay punk sound, which, again, was a huge inspiration for us. So I don't think either label didn't do what they said they would do for us. I think, again, it was just another one of those maybe right place, wrong time, or wrong place, right time. I don't know. And then when I referred to like us getting a manager and getting a little more of a business approach to things, that's when we decided and were kind of convinced to leave Lookout. We did that last record in 2003, Three Chord Revolution, with the Union label group, which was a label out of Canada, which were kind of positioned as like the epitaph of Canada. They had a great catalog, great people. They did a lot of really great things for us, but I think too, some of what we expected or what we saw, like we didn't get the distribution in America that we thought we would get. We weren't getting the promotion and the attention in the States, tons of attention and tons of hype in Canada. but we weren't getting it in Europe or in the States. So that kind of hurt us. I think Canada is really awesome and supportive of the arts, right? Like they have grants and the government will pay bands to make their music videos or produce their records. So we kind of thought from a budget perspective that we would have access to a little more, but what we then realized was because we were American, we didn't qualify for any of those,
Oh shit.
those nice to have benefits.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, again, maybe, and it has nothing to do with the label or the people, but, maybe not the right decision for us to have made at that time. And then beyond that, like I said, we just went back to DIY, to doing things real casually and making sure we were having fun with it. So that's when, like, say 10 records came into play when we put out the record in 2018. We wanted to just work with someone locally. We wanted to do something with a smaller label. It just felt like the right thing to do. So there wasn't a huge like decision to be made there. We also knew we've been kind of absent for 5 or 6 years, and the thought of reaching out to, Epitaph or Fat Records or something, just both didn't feel like it would get us anything. We just probably, I thought if we reach out to these labels, they're gonna be like, Ann Beretta, who are you guys again? But then also there was an assumption that with a bigger label, there would be that pressure to, to tour 10 months out of the year, 8 months out of the year, to put out records on a regular, like 18-month cycle. And it just wasn't interesting for us. We just wanted to really focus on putting some records out. Even with this new record, in all honesty, it was more about us making a record for us and doing something that we felt like we needed to do, saying some things that we felt like we needed to say in this record. And then if people hear it, that's really cool. But making the record was not necessarily the goal. Isn't to sell hundreds of thousands of records or have a million streams. It was more cathartic and more something that we needed to do. I'm hopeful that people will remember us and will listen, and the response so far has been really great. The pre-orders have been way better than I expected them to be. So I know people are interested and people want to hear it. So that makes me feel really great, and that's exciting. And because of that, we're going to try to play shows more regularly throughout this year, next year. Nothing really set in stone that I can speak to yet, but some things are in the works. So hopefully we will be traveling around and playing some shows again. So again, it feels really good to be able to do that. So, but there was a big part of me at one point that was so excited to make this record for very different reasons than I would have been excited to make a record for 15 years ago, 20 years ago, to where I was totally happy footing the bill and then just giving it away and just putting it out there for free. We're not going to do that. Like, we changed our minds. I think I was convinced not to do that, but that was originally kind of the plan. Was we would just put it out there as a pay what you want, or just put it out there and give it away, and whoever wants it can have it, and they trade it with your friends. Cool. Share it. Cool. But it wasn't about making money or making a living. So, and that in and of itself is very liberating and freeing. We didn't want that pressure. So going back to your question of like label choices, more recently, we just didn't want that pressure put on us of having to recoup or having to be forced to go on tour, or pressured to put out a certain type of record or write certain types of songs or what have you. So this was really all about us doing something for us, with the hope that other people would hear it and therefore get something out of it and do something, I guess. So it's not all about us doing something for us, but that was the original kind of intent there.
You had said something earlier, and it kind of makes it what you're saying now. I think that, you said the Fuel by Ramen thing and all those different bands came up. I think that would have buried you guys, honestly. Like, I think Lookout, even though I think Lookout was at that point, like I said, they were on their way out and you could see it, that they were just like kind of fizzling. But I feel like the Fuel by Ramen thing, they probably would have become that, hey, because a lot of labels at that time, I don't know if they did this, but it seems like a lot of their bands were very into fashion and had to look a certain way. And I don't know if that was Fueled by Ramen's thing. I think those bands just came in. I think a lot of those bands came in and said, we see this and we're going to go on this. And they're like, cool. I think that probably would have fucked you guys in the long run.
Yeah, possibly. That's kind of why I say like I can't really answer the question when it's asked to me, because who's to say what would have happened. But yeah, that's very likely. They were the bands that Fueled by Ramen started to sign when they really blew up and when they were getting a lot of like major label attention, and support, were very different, than us, and then a lot of bands in who were signed to the label at that time. And if you think about the bands that were signed after us, they were very different than the first handful of bands who, like I said, were all ska bands. So the evolution, I think, of that label was pretty impressive and was pretty natural.
Still, I mean, they're huge now, I think. Still.
Yeah, I don't truly know. Like I forget what major label, it might be Atlantic or something, owns Fueled by Ramen, and I haven't really kept up with it too
Electro,
much in the last.
Electro Music Group, I think it is.
Electric, yeah. So I haven't really kept up with it in a handful of years, so I'm not even sure who's on the label or if they're still very active. But yeah, I mean, the story of that label is pretty impressive if you think about it. Like two friends starting a label in their college dorm room, putting out records that their friends are making, evolves into multi-million dollar industry leading record label, putting out some of the best music of the time by the time they got to that point. So yeah, who's to say?
Yeah, I've wanted to like get them on the podcast because I would love to hear that story. I didn't know that Tony. I didn't know that he uh, did. I didn't know the dude that did Fest was the guy from Fuel by Ramen.
Yeah, I forget, like I forget what exactly his job was or how long he worked there. But it was a couple years that he was part of that label.
He said it was Tony, and then he did no idea.
And then he worked at No Idea, which maybe he still does. I don't know. Maybe this is a full-time job. I'm not sure. But again, that's kind of the going back to where we all started, like the community kind of culture, like of Richmond or of any hometown for anyone. But Gainesville, like you had two really great labels coming out of Gainesville. You had a ton of great music and bands. People who were in bands were working at those labels, helping find other bands. It's a great way. Like if you think about starting a label, like having people who play music and who tour, and maybe that sounds to some like a bad idea. Like why would you hire someone that's going to be gone half the year? But if you really think about it, like those people who are gone half the year, they're not all gone at the same time, and they're going out and meeting new bands, hearing new music, and bringing that back to the label. So it's pretty genius at the same time.
Yeah, they're like rooted in the scene more. So there's like more respect. They know the inside scoop. They can talk to more people around the country one to one. Totally makes that definitely works in their favor.
And in that scene specifically, like I don't think it was out of the question or even thought of as like something wrong, but very easily those labels were trading bands back and forth, were trading employees back and forth, probably several people working at both at the same time. Like there was just this community. I'm sure there was some natural competition between labels and bands, like there always is.
Oh, totally.
But at the core of it, at the heart of it, there's this community, brotherhood, sisterhood, this like let's support one another mentality, especially at that time of the 90s. There was nothing bad or wrong about having two really great or three or four really great labels coming out of the same city, especially when there's that much talent and music coming out of the same city.
Yeah. Actually, and to that point, I'm gonna wrap this up. So I think in the beginning I started talking about this. I don't know if I forget, even though it was like an hour or so ago, if I got the answer. But when I had mentioned Lawrence Arms put out "O Calcutta" in 2006, Against Me is starting to blow up around that time. So that style of music that I said that you guys would have fit into easily starts to really come about, and then later Gaslight Anthem. So when you guys are like done and you start to see this happen, was there a part of you, because you guys get back together later on, but did you kind of say like, shit, this is our time right now, like we're missing it?
um Maybe not at first, but certainly, yeah, sure. Or and even I think very honestly, there was a little bit of like, what the fuck in our heads. Like we were doing this very thing 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Why are people just catching on to it now? But we kind of, I don't know. We lived through like an interesting time in the late 90s of seeing having a level of success, very modest, moderate level of success, seeing some of our peers, bands like Alkaline Trio kind of dwarf everyone, playing thousands to thousands of people every night. But that was cool. There was nothing wrong with that. Like there was no jealousy there. Like again, kind of being in these scenarios of like bands being friends with other bands, you want to support and promote each other's success. And when one becomes a little more successful, who are the first people they're going to reach out to but their friends in other bands and bring them along for the ride? So it was, again, that element of community and punk rock in general, just, that's a huge part of punk rock at its core. And all of the bands, especially at that time, that was just very, very much ingrained in all of us. If there was any success to share, you were going to share it. If there was any support to give, you were going to give it. And, sure, we saw bands that, again, kind of sprung up out of nowhere. I'm sure not the same example I gave earlier about first tours on tour buses or whatever, but I remember a band at the time in the late 90s called Sugar Cult. They were awesome. I love that band, but I can't tell you how many times I heard, hey, they sound just like you. Hey, this song sounds just like your song, whatever. Why are you guys not as big as Sugar Cult, or why are you guys not getting major label attention? I can't answer that question either. I don't know how that happened for them. I know I really like that band. And again, no jealousy there, but everything happens differently for everyone. So I think to your question, like I don't know that we ever really thought we were missing out on something. I think we saw some of these bands, whether it was bands that we knew at that time, like Against Me, or bands that we became familiar with later, like Gaslight Anthem. I think, sure, like I said, sure, there was some component of why not us in those moments, but at the same time, there was recognition of like, oh, we might have influenced them, and so therefore we're part of their story somehow, And I talked to Brian at some point, Brian Fallon, like when Gaslight Anthem was like super popular, and he was coming through randomly to play solo shows, and we would play together, just sitting in a bar somewhere, really small club playing together, and just to find out from him, just randomly in a conversation, like, oh yeah, I remember when you put out that first Foundation record. I listened to that at work every day for an entire summer. It was awesome. So things like that would start to come up, and because of that, you kind of realize, or at least in my head, it wasn't, like I said, there was not that jealousy, there was not that like upset of someone else being more popular. It was like, cool. Had no idea you heard that record, had no idea you liked it, had no idea it might have influenced something that you did later. But just those little moments, amongst like friends, even if you're just becoming friends, like super cool. And I've had several experiences like that, just to find out like this band that's really popular, a band that you might hear on the radio very regularly, is influenced by something you did 20 years ago. Like that's super cool. And it's, like that for me is enough of a reward. Like, do I wish I was a multimillionaire selling millions of records? Sure. But I'm not. That's okay. Knowing that we're in some way contributing to someone else's story, someone else's legacy, whether that's a famous band, a popular band, or a small hometown band that never leaves their garage, or it's the individual who comes to the show. And, I can't tell you, like, I know other bands have this story too, but the first time, and I've only heard it a few times, thankfully, I think, but the first time I met someone at a show who was, I met a 16-year-old girl at a show who tells me, hey, the song on this record saved my life. Like the minute you hear those words, or you hear a story of, I was considering killing myself, but I heard this song and it meant something to me. Like, dude, you cannot unhear that, and that will live with me forever. And just that one thing in and of itself is worthy of us doing what we did and going through what we did and having whatever reach we had or level of success we had. So those moments, like you can't take those back, and they are so meaningful and things that I think about pretty often.
Yeah, I can imagine in that moment, you're just like, I have no idea how to respond to this. Like,
Yeah,
that's so heavy.
it's it's very heavy, but when it happens, and if you're someone, and I think we were always really good and, really humble and really approachable. We would hang out after shows and we, still do when we play, but crowds were bigger then, so we would hang out with shows, we would meet people, we would engage with the audience. And because of that, like I said, we made a lot of friends. We connected with people that we would see tour after tour, year after year. Even today, still talk to some of those people, and their kids are now introduced to our music through the parents. So it's like, it's a really interesting thing. But yeah, those moments, like, they're huge, and not everyone can experience those or will. And, to think that you created some art that someone is responding to that emotionally, that heavily, that it has such an impact that the thought of ending their life was in their head, and then suddenly it wasn't because of something you created. Like, holy shit, man! Like, that's worth more to me personally than selling a million records.
Yeah, that's
It's easy for me to say not having sold a million records, but those things, like, I look back at those moments and moments like that, and that for me is worth any hardship that I've personally ever gone through.
so this question takes a complete step away from everything you just said, which I'm just saying this because it's like that's such a great fucking story, like how that happened for someone. And then I'm gonna lead it up with, are you guys gonna play this year's fest?
Um, I'm not allowed to say.
I figured I would try.
Yep.
Okay. Would make sense. Are you gonna go
Let's just
to?
say that phone calls have been made.
Okay. I mean, you played the first one, so this is the 20th. I would guess yes, but we'll see. A friend of mine, Amber Payne from Chicago. I don't know if you've ever met her out there. She was pretty involved in the scene, and she's a big Chicago. I don't know what the word is, but she texted me a couple weeks ago, and she's like, "Are you going to go to the Avail show in Carborough?" And I was like, "I doubt I can get tickets." And so she actually got tickets for her fiance. No, sorry, her boyfriend. I don't want to fuck that up. They're flying from Chicago to Raleigh to go to Carborough to see Avail and Hot Water Music. So I'm actually going to go to that show. But I believe they're playing in Richmond, like definitely, right? Because there's only like 3 shows.
No, I don't think they are. They played in Richmond,
Really?
I guess, right before the pandemic. It was like the start of their series of shows. They did 2 nights here in town, and it was amazing. It was so good to see those guys on the stage again, and so much fun. But no, I don't. At least I don't. I'm not in the loop. I don't know if they have any Richmond shows booked. But everything I saw was, I think, what you mentioned. There was 3 shows. I think Carborough, Atlanta, and somewhere in Florida.
Oh, okay. That's so. Yeah, I guess that Florida makes sense since with hot water. I was gonna see if you were gonna go to the one in Richmond, but I guess there's not one in Richmond, so I guess you wouldn't be
Yeah,
going
at
to
least
that
not
one.
one that I know of. But if there is a show again in Richmond, yes, I will absolutely be there.
Yeah, first time I saw hot water was literally this past fest, and it was so different because it was the outdoor stage and that like soccer field looking thing.
Hmm. Yep.
And it's just such a different vibe. But to see them in a club and it's not like a huge club, and see them in Vail, I'm gonna be like shit, like watching this show. It's gonna be fucking gnarly.
Yeah. No, it's I guarantee you'll have a good time. Like, it's awesome to see those guys doing stuff again too.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. So before I wrap it up, is there any like awesome, crazy, funny story that you've always wanted to tell that you've never like told in an interview?
Oh man, that's a lot of pressure. What a cool question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Oh, I'll uh
Everyone always says, and they're like, "Oh, there's this one
I'm
thing."
trying to think of like something that might be safe to share.
It's usually the theme.
Maybe this is more uh I don't know, some advice or whatever. I think everyone's always kind of heard, like, don't meet your heroes, you'll be disappointed. I don't think, trying to think, I think of all the bands that, again, if you had asked me at one point if I would ever be friends with some of these people or meet or play shows with, some of these bands, there was absolutely no way that I saw that ever happening. I don't think that I was ever disappointed by meeting someone, so I'll use the Descendants as an example. Amazing band. We did a tour with Less Than Jake and All. So maybe calling them the Descendants is not the right thing. Milo did show up to a show, and they did a Descendant set kind of unannounced, so that was amazing. But to be able to like jump on stage with those guys, sing some songs, to become friends with the guys in the band, and for them to be just like incredibly gracious and humble, and someone like Bill and Stefan, who mixed and helped produce our second record, our first for Lookout. They were just, we learned so much from them. They kind of took us under their wing, and they shared their experiences with us, things not to do when you're on the road, how not to behave when you're in a club and in the presence of your audience, or telling stories of them being on the road with bands who treated them really poorly. And hey guys, this is why we don't treat you that way. Learning those lessons, I can tell you that, I've learned many of those lessons from some of my teenage heroes, and that's been pretty amazing. Like I said, I don't think I've experienced a meet your hero and be really greatly disappointed. Although some of the stories I heard from Bill about some of my heroes, I was disappointed in, but I haven't met them, so I can't qualify them as being that same thing for me. But yeah, it's been really an amazing just experience, like I said. So I think if anyone's afraid to, meet their hero, just fucking go for it. If you have an opportunity, maybe you'll become friends with them and it'll be awesome.
Yeah, I've never heard out of all these interviews, I've never heard anybody, one person, say anything bad about any of the Descendants.
They're the best, man. They're like absolutely the best. So when we made the Other Side of the Coin record, the Ann Beretta record, that was after Bitter Tongues. It was the acoustic record I talked about earlier. We had just come home from touring with Less Than Jake and All, which I think was a couple months tour around the country. As we were putting that record together and thinking about songs, we were writing some songs and to put on it. I just randomly called Bill Stevenson, who I think everyone knows is drummer from Descendants and All, to say like, hey man, again, just to ask, similar to the Chuck Reagan story very earlier on, hey, I'd really love to cover Long Distance for this record, but by the way, it's an acoustic record and it's going to be more like James Taylor than All. And he was just like, dude, fucking awesome. But if you're going to do it, you've got to play it right. So pick up your guitar. Let me teach you how to play it. I got a guitar lesson from Bill Stevenson, one of the best punk rock drummers of all time, over the phone to teach me how to play a song that he wrote.
That's a good story.
So that's something I don't think I've ever really shared. But
That's
yeah,
awesome.
how amazing! Like, I mean, if you can imagine the look on my face,
Yeah.
the phone, up to a shoulder, with an acoustic guitar in my hand, with a drummer or a person who's known mostly as being a drummer, is teaching me how to play that song that he wrote, and has such an ear on him that he, at one point, he was like, "Hey man, stop! Your G string is sharp. You need to tune that thing." Like, it was absolutely amazing.
Holy shit. Dude, that's awesome.
Yeah, to be sitting on the floor with a guitar, getting a guitar lesson from Bill Stevenson, like I will never forget that.
Wait, you said that's on the 12 or other
It's
side of the coin?
Yeah, it's on the Other Side of the Coin record.
Wait, what was the name of the
And
song again?
the Long Distance.
It's
And
not
it's
on Spotify.
Yeah, it's not on. It's only going to be on Bandcamp. Cover songs that we recorded are not on all of the different platforms because they all handle covers and royalties and approvals differently. So Bandcamp kind of covers it with their like platform and whatever program they have in place, versus other platforms where each platform I might have to pay a licensing fee to those bands, which I don't mind doing it. But if you add it up, over half a dozen songs on 10 different streaming services, and each one of them is going to charge you $100 to license the song. It wasn't cost effective enough to put the full record, if there was a cover included on some of those platforms.
Oh, that's actually good to
So
know.
if you go to Bandcamp, you can hear the song, but Apple Music, Amazon, all the other streams, Spotify and such, that it's not going to be on there.
All right, I'll make sure to link to that from the show notes, so people listening. And if I don't, message anyone listening, message me, and I'll make sure I do that after the fact. But usually when I'm editing these, I take notes, and so I'll like make sure I do that. Well, cool, man. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. What would you, before last question, what would you like to plug? It could be about something you're doing. It could be something that your friend's doing. It could be both.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, first, just thanks for having me. This has
Yeah,
been
dude.
awesome. It's been awesome to kind of go down memory lane a little bit. And then, yeah, like I've mentioned, we've got a new record coming out.
So when you say that though, are is like how is it coming out again? And when?
Yeah, yeah. So we've got a new record coming out. It's called Rise. 11 songs. I think all of them are awesome and some of the best stuff we've done. It officially comes out February 17th, which even that is kind of a random thing. It's not a Friday, which I think is typically the standard, but comes out February 17th. We are putting it out ourselves. There's no physical copies of it yet, but we're working on that. So it's only available digitally for, download streaming, and you can purchase it. You can pay what you want in some cases. I think on Bandcamp I think generally it's like $10, but Bandcamp has a pay what you want feature that we've added there too. So yeah, it comes out in a couple weeks from the time that we're talking. So February 17th.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think the timing. I think yours is actually good. Your episode is going to come out the day after you guys launch. So that actually might work in your favor because it'll say, "Hey, it's out now. It was released yesterday."
And I think we talked about this a little while ago, but like that's another example, again, like those friendships from the 90s are very much still present today. Like, Chris from Less Than Jake sings on that song called Better Medicine from our new record.
Oh shit.
That's the first single. That's the first song that we're using to kind of promote the record. And, so that was just a simple phone call of like, hey, I've got this song. I think you'd be really great singing on it. Would you be interested or able to do that? And there was not even a thought or a pause. It was just, yep, send it my way. Send me the files. I've
Wow.
got a studio at the house. I'll sing it and send it back to you. And, you know, it was awesome. So yeah, Chris is on that song, and I'll send that over to you.
All right, cool. No, that's awesome. Can I leave that part in where you say that he's singing on that, or do you want that to be?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, man. So last question. What scene ethics do you hold on to this day?
Man, I think oh, I think again, like coming up in more of a DIY culture and kind of time in the music scene, I keep a lot of that with me. I think I keep a lot of I want to, when we play shows, as an example, I also I want people to have fun. I want to be a positive role model or set a good example. I don't want to treat people like shit. I don't want to, we're all in it together. So I think maybe that's it. Like we're all in it together, like we always treated, and I think bands from our time did, like we all treated the audience as equals. And that's certainly something that we still carry forward today. Like I mean, any band that thinks they're anything without their audience is just wrong, So I think I think whether it's the DIY, like we're not gonna ask anyone to do anything that we wouldn't do ourselves. It's probably that, and the fact that we try to treat our audience as equals.